During World War II, a concentration camp in the former Yugoslavia was identified by survivors and experts as even more brutal than Auschwitz. This camp, known as Jasenovac, was not under Nazi control but rather the Croatian fascists of the Ustaše regime, allies of Nazi Germany. Its size and the level of violence carried out there made it the third largest concentration camp in Europe in terms of area, but what happened within its walls was even more horrifying. Jasenovac was not only a place of mass extermination, it was a complex where torture, murder and atrocities were carried out with such extreme brutality that even the Nazis, unable to comprehend the level of savagery, pressured for its reduction or closure. Despite being an ally of the Third Reich, the Ustaše regime took the concept of concentration camps to new heights of horror. Why was Jasenovac so brutal? And how could the world ignore the atrocities at Jasenovac? The formation of Yugoslavia and ethnic tensions. In 1918, after the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, a new state was founded in the Balkans, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, which would later be known as Yugoslavia. This country, which translates to Land of the South Slavs, brought together a range of peoples and ethnicities very different from one another. Among its inhabitants were Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Montenegrins, North Macedonians, Albanians and Bosnian Muslims. Smaller communities, such as Jews and Roma, also coexisted on its territory. What seemed like a solution for the union of South Slavic peoples quickly turned into an integration challenge. For centuries, the different groups that composed Yugoslavia had lived in a region marked by constant tensions, shaped by the empires that had dominated the area. The division was not only geographical, but deeply cultural and religious. One of the main divisions between the peoples of the new Yugoslavia was that of the Serbs and Croats. Though both shared Slavic roots, their religious and cultural differences were marked. The Serbs were mostly Orthodox, while the Croats practiced Catholicism, creating a strong rivalry. Moreover, over the centuries, the different groups had been ruled by external powers, which further exacerbated tensions. Since the late 15th century, the Ottomans had dominated much of the region, leaving an indelible mark on the culture and identities of the Balkan peoples. When the Austro-Hungarians began to expand from 1700, they pushed the Turks out of the northern part of the region, creating a new dynamic in inter-ethnic relations. The imposition of borders and control by foreign powers fueled mistrust between the peoples now forming Yugoslavia, creating a breeding ground for future conflicts. Hidden divisions, the politics of conquest and religion in the Balkans. Throughout history, conquering powers have employed the divide and conquer strategy to keep peoples under control. This tactic not only created internal conflicts but also ensured that communities remained divided, more focused on their differences than on the common enemy. In the Balkans, both the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire effectively used this policy, sowing the seeds of conflicts that would last for centuries. A clear example of how religion was used as a divisive tool can be found in Bosnia, where Turkish rule caused a significant transformation in the religious practices of the population. Under Ottoman control for several centuries, many Bosnians converted to Islam, though in genetic terms, Bosnian Muslims shared roots with the Serbs and Croats. Their new faith distanced them culturally from their neighbors. This religious difference became one of the primary distinctions, leading to the creation of a separate identity within the Balkan region. The conflicts in the Balkans were not only the result of external impositions, but also of the complex relationships between the different peoples inhabiting the region. In mountainous and isolated areas, where central power rarely reached, endless cycles of vengeance and retribution emerged between various groups. The competition for favor from the dominant powers fueled these clashes, making any possibility of unity among the South Slavic peoples difficult. Religion played an essential role in this division. In Croatia, Catholicism was not only a religion but also an identity that was fervently lived, even hostile toward other beliefs. In Serbia, Eastern Orthodoxy was not only the basis of faith, but also a symbol of resistance against foreign imperialism. The religious tension between Catholics and Orthodox became a hot-button issue, fanning the flames of what would become a perpetual conflict in the region. Moreover, in the midst of this dispute between Serbs and Croats, Bosnian Muslims and Jews found themselves caught, with their own religious identities seen with both suspicion and curiosity. Though often overlooked, linguistic differences also deepened the divisions. While Serbs and Croats spoke the same language, their scripts were different. Croats used the Latin alphabet, while Serbs used Cyrillic. This seemingly trivial difference became a crucial marker of identity, especially in times of conflict. This seemingly minor detail revealed much more than it appeared. In the most tense moments of the region's history, the way someone wrote could determine whether they were an ally or an enemy. Thus, what seemed like a superficial cultural difference became a dividing line that, in many cases, marked the life and death of individuals. The Ustaše and the rise to power, the emergence of a fascist regime in Croatia. Before delving into the grim details of the concentration camps run by the Ustaše during World War II, it is crucial to understand how this fascist group came to power and what ideologies fueled their actions. Throughout the war, the world witnessed countless atrocities committed by various factions, but the history of the Ustaše, the radical Croatian organization allied with Hitler, deserves special analysis. From 1941 to 1945, Croatia was governed by the Ustaše regime, an ultranationalist organization that arose in a context of growing political discontent and tension. The Ustaše, whose name means rebel or to rise up in Croatian, was founded in 1929 by Ante Pavelić, a nationalist lawyer and politician who advocated for an independent Croatia, free from foreign influences, and especially from Serbian presence. Pavelić had been a member of the Croatian Party of Rights, and after the creation of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1918, he fervently sought Croatia's autonomy within the new state, until his demands became more radical. Initially, the Ustaše were not a major force in Croatia. In fact, during the 1930s, the organization was still marginal. However, the political situation in Europe, marked by the rise of fascism in Italy under Mussolini and Nazism in Germany under Hitler, had a significant impact on the evolution of the Ustaše movement. With the threat of an increasingly militarized Europe, many Croats began to see the Ustaše as a potential solution to their problems, a dictatorship that would grant them independence and total control over the regions they considered part of their territory, such as Bosnia. Pavelić and his followers adopted many of Mussolini's policies, including his fascist ideology, the glorification of violence as a legitimate means to achieve their goals, and symbols that reflected totalitarianism. The Ustaše also closely aligned themselves with Nazi Germany, seeking Hitler's protection and the creation of a completely independent and homogeneous Croatian state, one that would exclude Serbs, Jews, and other minorities. Before World War II, Croatia's political situation was marked by growing polarization. On one side were the Ustaše and other ultranationalist movements demanding independence and the creation of a purified Croatian state. On the other side were Croatian socialists and communists, who promoted a more inclusive vision linked to a unified Yugoslavia. This division was based not only on political issues, but also on ethnic and religious tensions that had marked the region's history. In 1934, the Ustaše committed an act of extreme violence by supporting the assassination of King Alexander I of Yugoslavia. This event was pivotal, not only because of the political violence it represented, but also because it was the first assassination of a head of state captured on film. This act further exacerbated internal tensions within Yugoslavia and marked a turning point in the history of the Ustaše, who were already intensifying their campaign of terror in Croatia and Bosnia, seeking to destabilize the Yugoslav regime. With the outbreak of World War II, tensions reached their peak. In 1941, after the invasion of Yugoslavia by Axis forces, the Ustaše seized the opportunity to declare the independent state of Croatia, NDH, a puppet state under Nazi control, with Pavelić as its leader. This new state not only became an ally of Nazi Germany, but also implemented extreme policies of persecution, repression and extermination of Serbs, Jews, Roma and other groups considered undesirable. The concentration and extermination camps established by the Ustaše in the NDH, such as the infamous Jasenovac camp, became synonymous with brutality. These camps, far from being mere detention centers, were places where prisoners were subjected to unspeakable torture and exterminated under inhumane conditions. The Ustaše's racist ideology, supported by their alliance with the Third Reich, sought the ethnic cleansing of Croatia, making their regime one of the most ruthless in Nazi-occupied Europe. Ideology and objectives of the Ustaše: the vision of a fascist and exclusive state. The ideology of the Ustaše, led by Ante Pavelić, was based on a set of radical beliefs that not only transformed Croatia into a totalitarian state, but also marked with fire the policies of persecution and extermination that would define the regime during World War II. Below are the key principles that guided the rise and governance of the Ustaše. Croatia, exclusively for Croats. Pavelić and his followers' vision of a pure Croatia was rooted in strong ethno-religious nationalism. In this view, Croatia was to be a homogeneous nation composed only of ethnic Croats. For the Ustaše, Catholicism was not only the official religion, but also a symbol of national identity and purity. Islam, while not considered an integral part of the Croatian people, was tolerated in Bosnia due to its perception of bringing political and social order. However, other religious groups, such as Orthodox Serbs, Jews, and Bosnian Muslims of Serbian or Croatian origin, were seen as foreign and unacceptable within this ideal of national purity. This exclusive vision sought to reshape the entire social structure of the region to ensure that Croatia would be a space exclusively for Catholic Croats. Racial superiority. One of the most sinister beliefs of the Ustaše regime was the idea that Serbs, Jews, and Roma were inferior races that needed to be eliminated or displaced to ensure the superiority of Croats. The Ustaše adopted a radically xenophobic stance, similar to that of the Nazis, and carried out a systematic campaign of extermination against ethnic and religious minorities. Anti-Semitism and the persecution of Serbs were two of the regime's most terrifying characteristics. During World War II, the Ustaše regime implemented an ethnic cleansing program that included mass murders, deportations, and the creation of concentration camps like Jasenovac, where thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma were brutally killed. This racist ideology sought not only the physical elimination of the enemies of the Croatian nation, but also their total cultural and social disappearance. Territorial expansion. The Ustaše not only sought a pure Croatia in ethnic and religious terms, but also aimed to expand the borders of the Croatian nation to include territories they considered legitimately theirs. In their vision, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and parts of Slovenia and Serbia should be annexed to Croatia. This territorial expansion was part of their desire to create a greater Croatian state, in line with other expansionist policies of the time, such as those of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In practice, this idea of territorial expansion led to the brutal occupation and cleansing of invaded territories, which were subjected to violent ethnic and religious reconfiguration to make them more Croatian and less Serbian. Single-party state. Like other contemporary fascist regimes in Europe, the Ustaše promoted the creation of a one-party state, where political power was concentrated exclusively in their hands. The supreme leader, known as poglavnik, in Croatian, supreme leader, was Ante Pavelić, who not only took control of the political sphere but also of the military and social aspects of Croatia. The Ustaše imposed a totalitarian structure, suppressed political opposition, and destroyed any attempt at resistance, whether from socialists, communists, or even Croatian nationalists who did not share their vision. This concentration of political power, coupled with their brutality toward any form of dissent, made the NDH, independent state of Croatia, an absolutely authoritarian regime. The Ustaše's control over society extended beyond politics to culture, education, and religion, with the goal of creating a completely homogeneous society in terms of ideology and ethnicity. German invasion and Operation Punishment, the collapse of Yugoslavia. In March 1941, Yugoslavia's political situation was at a critical juncture. Regent Prince Pavle, who governed on behalf of the young King Peter II, had been a close ally of Nazi Germany. Pavle had maintained a pro-German stance during the early years of World War II, granting Hitler permission for German troops to cross Yugoslav territory on their way to Greece, where Mussolini had failed in his invasion. However, King Peter II, supported by factions within the Yugoslav military and with British backing, decided to take control of the country. At just 17 years old, The young king deposed his cousin Pavla and categorically rejected Hitler's request. This act of defiance enraged Hitler, who saw this rejection as an act of betrayal. In response, Hitler launched the dreaded Operation Punishment, or Operation Castigo, which invaded Yugoslavia on April 6, 1941. The German invasion of Yugoslavia was brutal and merciless. The operation involved not only conventional military attacks, but also a ferocious campaign of bombings, reprisals, and mass killings against the civilian population. Within days, the Nazi army dismantled the Yugoslav resistance, and the country was quickly divided among Axis powers. Meanwhile, local guerrilla movements began organizing fierce resistance. The history of guerrilla warfare in Yugoslavia and the subsequent horrors of the conflict form a separate narrative, but it is indisputable that the 1941 invasion of Yugoslavia became one of the most brutal episodes of World War II. In this context, the Croatian Ustaše, allies of Nazi Germany, began taking control of an independent Croatia within the Axis structure, which would lead to the creation of the independent state of Croatia, NDH, under the fascist regime of Pavelić. The German invasion and the local response laid the groundwork for the complex and violent conflict that would unfold in the Balkans over the following years. Extermination camps. In the NDH, Jasenovac, and the Invisible Horrors. Before the Nazis established the first extermination camp in Chełmno, Poland in 1941, extermination camps had already been set up on the territory of the NDH, independent state of Croatia. The most infamous of these camps was Jasenovac, which began operations in May 1941, just months after the establishment of the fascist Croatian state under the Ustaše regime. Jasenovac, known for its extreme brutality, was designed to exterminate the enemies of the regime, primarily Serbs, Jews, and Roma, as well as political opponents and prisoners of war. During the early months of its operation, it is estimated that between 10,000 and 70,000 people were killed in the camp. Although the exact figures remain uncertain due to the clandestine nature of the crimes, the victims were systematically eliminated out of the public eye, making it difficult to tally the full extent of the tragedy. Most of the massacres were not officially recorded, leading to confusion about the scale of the suffering. The brutality of Jasenovac was unparalleled. Victims, many of whom were Serbian and Croatian Jews, were often killed in the most horrific ways. Many prisoners were thrown into deep pits, some of which still contain human remains discovered by spelunkers today. In some cases, victims were tied together in groups and pushed into the pits, where they struggled to stay afloat while others fell in. Children and babies were not spared, and many women and girls were sexually assaulted before being murdered. The camp was also infamous for its immediate methods of extermination. Some prisoners were shot on the spot, others were thrown into a nearby river, or even grenades were thrown at groups. The conditions in Jasenovac were so extreme that victims not only suffered physical torture, but also the psychological terror of an endless extermination. Although the concentration camp was dismantled with the end of the war, Jasenovac remains a symbol of the lesser-known horrors of World War II. Unlike other Nazi extermination camps such as Auschwitz, whose history has been more widely documented, Jasenovac remains a dark reminder of the atrocities committed at the heart of Europe under a Croatian fascist regime allied with Nazi Germany. Testimonies from survivors and archaeological investigations continue to shed light on this dark chapter in history as the world seeks to understand the magnitude of the suffering inflicted during those years. Infamous executioners and killing methods. The horror of Jasenovac. At the Jasenovac concentration camp, brutality not only came from the oppressive system, but also from the executioners who carried out the extermination orders with unimaginable ferocity. Two of the most infamous individuals responsible for the horrors at the camp were Miroslav Filipović Mović and Vojislav Lurić, whose methods of torture and murder terrorized the victims and left an indelible mark on the history of the camp. Miroslav Filipović, known to the inmates as Brother Satan, was a Catholic monk who became one of the most feared executioners at Jasenovac. His involvement in the camp was marked by indescribable brutality, and he is credited with one of the most atrocious methods of killing victims, cutting throats with a peculiar agricultural knife, known locally in the Balkans, which he used as an extension of his hand. This blade, fixed to his wrist, allowed him to kill with chilling precision and efficiency, making him a highly effective executioner. What distinguishes Filipović even more is not just his modus operandi, but his systematic sadism. He openly boasted of killing thousands of people with this method, but one of his most disturbing crimes was his daily ritual of stomping on children until they died. Every morning before starting his day, Filipović would stomp on a child with such force that he would crush them, a practice of terror that became part of the camp's culture of fear. And the perversity didn't stop there. In an act of heart-wrenching cruelty, Filipović would force new guards to follow his example, stomping on children as a kind of initiation rite to the work at Jasenovac. Those who refused to participate were subjected to brutal punishments or sent to fight on the front lines against the communist partisans. This twisted mentality spread throughout the camp, creating a culture of impunity and monstrosity. After the war ended, Filipović was captured and, as one of the most hated and sought-after figures, was publicly hanged as part of his justice. The second infamous executioner in the history of Jasenovac was Vjoslav Lurić, known for his cruelty and brutality. Unlike Filipović, Lurić managed to escape the fate of other perpetrators of the camp, fleeing to fascist Spain under Francisco Franco after the fall of the Ustaše regime. Although he was feared and hated within the NDH after the collapse of the Croatian fascist government, he escaped justice. Lurić continued to be a dark figure even outside Yugoslavia. For years he lived with total impunity in Spain, but his story came to an end in 1969 when Yugoslav secret police agents tracked him down and killed him. Lurić's death was an act of vengeance for the crimes he had committed, though many would argue that he had escaped justice for far too long. These infamous executioners, Mović and Lurić, represented only a fraction of the violence unleashed at the Jasenovac camp, where tens of thousands of lives were exterminated in the most horrific ways. The Jasenovac concentration camp, like other World War II extermination camps, left deep scars that continue to resonate in the collective memory of humanity. Extermination methods and inhumane conditions in Jasenovac. The Jasenovac concentration camp was not only a place of incarceration, but also an extermination complex where the Ustaše implemented systematic methods to kill thousands of people. During the occupation of the fascist regime from 1941 to 1945, prisoners, primarily Serbs, Jews, Roma, and anti-fascist Croats, were subjected to unbearable conditions. Although the Ustaše attempted to implement a gas chamber to kill their victims, the results were ineffective and thus more direct and brutal methods were employed. In Jasenovac, executions were carried out not only by shootings, but also through methods such as throat-cutting with agricultural knives, one of the most common forms of extermination. Additionally, many victims were eviscerated while still alive, prolonging their suffering in a horrifying manner. In the subcamp of Gradina, located in the Jasenovac region, some of the most appalling forms of extermination were carried out. Victims were taken to mass graves where they were killed in large numbers. Often prisoners were tied in pairs, struck in the head with mallets, and then thrown into the Sava River, a process designed not only to quickly dispose of the bodies but also to destroy evidence of the crimes. When the mass graves were filled, the bodies were simply abandoned to the current, and it is estimated that tens of thousands of people lost their lives in these execution fields. The extent of the deaths at Jasenovac is difficult to determine with certainty due to the Ustaše's efforts to eliminate any evidence of their crimes. As the war neared its end, many bodies were exhumed and burned in a rudimentary manner, but even these attempts to erase the traces of the genocide could not prevent the brutality of the massacres from being revealed. Victim estimates vary, but historical studies suggest that between 80,000 and 100,000 people were killed at Jasenovac alone, not including victims in other Ustaše-controlled regions. Some historians, however, maintain that the death toll could exceed 200,000, given the scale of the extermination and the multiple massacre locations across the country. Despite the enormous number of victims, some prisoners managed to survive the brutality of the camp, and many of them have shared heartbreaking accounts of what they experienced. Life in Jasenovac was marked by extreme overcrowding, horrible conditions in the barracks, and a lack of medical care. Prisoners, including Roma, lived in the open, with no protection against the weather and no refuge from rain, wind, or snow. The spread of diseases like typhus and dysentery was common, as there was no sanitation and the sick received no treatment. Malnutrition and unsanitary conditions created an atmosphere of constant desperation and suffering. Food supplies in the camp were insufficient and of poor quality. Prisoners were given minimal portions, often consisting of watery broth with some cabbage leaves or dry bread, while those who were too weak to work or meet labor quotas were sent to the execution fields. In fact, forced labor was a constant, and prisoners worked from dawn until dusk under extreme physical conditions, either in brick factories, metal workshops, or doing other exhausting tasks. Those who failed to meet work requirements or fell ill were subjected to severe punishment, or in the worst cases, executed. Despite these inhumane conditions, some prisoners found ways to resist and organize within the camp. Several formed mutual aid networks, helping each other as best as they could to survive. Some even managed to carry out sabotage actions against work projects or pass information to the partisans fighting the Ustaše regime. However, escaping from Jasenovac was almost impossible, and those who attempted to flee were generally captured and executed without mercy. The history of Jasenovac is one of the darkest in World War II, a place where death and suffering were a constant. The genocide carried out by the Ustaše at this camp demonstrates the human capacity for extreme cruelty, while the survivors display remarkable courage in the face of the most brutal dehumanization. Post-war consequences. The Jasenovac concentration camp is one of the darkest places in 20th century history, and although its name is not as well known as other concentration camps, its brutality is unmatched. Located in what is now Croatia, Jasenovac was an extermination complex that operated from 1941 to 1945 under the regime of the Ustaše, a Croatian fascist group. This camp was not only a place of imprisonment, it was designed for extermination, and it did so with a macabre efficiency that even terrified the Nazis. Unlike other concentration camps, Jasenovac did not exclusively use gas or shootings. Prisoners, mostly Serbs, Jews, Roma, and anti-fascist Croats, were executed in particularly brutal ways: throat-cutting with agricultural knives, eviscerations, bludgeoning with hammers, and systematic torture. Here, death was not an isolated event, but a continuous process, and violence had been institutionalized to such an extent that the guards saw prisoners as mere cannon fodder. The camp was not only a place of immediate death, but also a forced labor center, where malnourished and exhausted prisoners were used as slave labor in factories and construction projects. Those who could not perform the strenuous tasks were sent to the so-called execution fields, a term that referred to areas where prisoners were killed en masse. The weakest, sickest, or simply exhausted were tied, beaten, and thrown into the Sava River or buried in mass graves, often without being counted. The most chilling aspect is that as the war drew to a close, the Ustaše, fearing that the atrocities would be discovered, made desperate efforts to destroy the evidence. They exhumed bodies, burned them, and tried to erase all traces of their crimes. However, death toll estimates for Jasenovac range from 80,000 to 100,000 prisoners, though some historians suggest the number could exceed 200,000 if victims from other locations in Croatia are included. Despite the magnitude of suffering, some prisoners survived. Their accounts, preserved through testimonies and interviews, offer a terrifying glimpse into the conditions within the camp: overcrowding, extreme hunger, diseases like typhus and dysentery, and an exhausting work system that pushed prisoners to the brink of death. The hunger was so extreme that survivors recalled eating grass, roots, and even insects to survive. Perhaps the most shocking thing is how a camp like Jasenovac managed to operate with so little resistance, even in the early days, when the Allies and the Nazis were aware of the atrocities occurring in the region. Because it was run by the Ustaše, a fascist group, Jasenovac was more than just a concentration camp. It was an ideological extermination center, a place where hatred and violence became state policy. The memory of Jasenovac, though often overshadowed by the history of camps like Auschwitz or Dachau, remains a reminder of the human capacity to inflict suffering. Though many Croats do not acknowledge the magnitude of what happened in that camp, the evidence is clear. Jasenovac was a place where human life had no value. In the years following the war, when the communist regime took control in Yugoslavia, the memory of Jasenovac was not easily erased. But Tito's regime preferred to remain silent about the atrocities committed by the Ustaše, focusing more on the fight against fascism and nationalism. However, with the dissolution of Yugoslavia in the late 1980s and early 1990s, nationalism resurfaced in the Balkans, and the old wounds of the Croatian Civil War began to reopen. For reasons like this, the Jasenovac concentration camp remains a dark reminder of the horrors that can arise when hatred, fascism, and supremacist ideology combine, the concentration camp that even terrified the Nazis.